Chapter 81, Improving. Then, let's start with hunting some monsters, I said as I glanced at the map I carried. The forest was vast and full of unknown dangers. But danger meant the potential to become stronger. After all, how could one become stronger without putting oneself into dangerous situations? There are a few places I've noticed, she said, her voice thoughtful. They're not marked on the map, but I've sensed strong presences there. Likely the territory of powerful monsters. If you're looking for a challenge, those places might be worth exploring. I nodded, tracing a few points on the map where the terrain seemed more rugged, more likely to be home to the kind of creatures that would help us both grow. Let's start with these locations, I said, pointing to a spot not too far from our current position. It's marked as a rocky outcrop, and if I'm right, there should be some beasts hiding in those crevices. Good choice, Vitaliera purred. The rocky terrain will likely house creatures that are territorial and strong. Be prepared. They won't go down easily. That's exactly what I'm counting on, I replied. The tougher the fight, the more I'll learn. With a plan in mind, we began to make our way through the forest, moving quietly but swiftly. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a constant reminder that this was a place where life and death were inextricably linked. After some time, we reached the first spot on the map, a rugged area where jagged rocks jutted out from the ground like the teeth of some ancient beast. The air here felt different, heavier, charged with the presence of something powerful. This is the place, I whispered, scanning the area for any signs of movement. And while doing so, I closed my eyes. What are you doing? Vitaliera asked. It seemed she had noticed that I had slowed my movements. I am going to try something new. I let my mind drift back to a memory that had stayed with me ever since my training with Master. It was one of those lessons that had seemed impossible at the time, but now, with my recent breakthrough to 3-star, it was finally within reach. // // // // // Master stood before me, the wind gently rustling the leaves around us. Watch closely, he had said, his voice calm and authoritative. To truly master your mana, you must learn to merge it with the elements around you. The wind is one of the easiest elements to start with because it is ever-present and fluid. He extended his hand, and I felt a subtle shift in the air. His mana flowed from his body, merging seamlessly with the breeze. The wind seemed to respond to his command, swirling and dancing around him as if it were an extension of his own being. Feel the wind, he instructed, his eyes closing in concentration. Become one with it. Let your mana flow into the air, not as a separate entity, but as part of the wind itself. I watched in awe as the wind around him seemed to hum with energy. It moved with purpose, wrapping around trees, brushing against leaves, and creating a symphony of soft, rustling sounds. This technique allows you to extend your senses beyond your physical body, Master explained. While many Awakens spread their senses to detect the mana of others, this method uses the wind to perceive the very bodies of your targets. It's a more refined, precise way to gather information. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and imagined myself becoming one with the wind. Slowly, I felt my mana seep into the air, merging with the breeze in my imagination. At that time, I imagined the sensation to be strange but exhilarating. The wind was no longer just a natural element. It was an extension of myself. At least that was how I imagined it. Since I was not able to expand my mana outside of my body at that time, I naturally was not able to understand and experience it completely, but that was fine for me. This technique will allow you to detect the presence of others with great accuracy, Master explained. You can use it to count patrols, detect hidden threats, and even anticipate movements. But most importantly, you can use it to sense monsters when they are around. Everything has a physical form, and no traces can be completely removed. The world is bound by physical rules. Never forget that. I opened my eyes and let out a slow breath, centering myself in the present. At that time, I hadn't been able to fully grasp the technique. My mana had been too raw, too uncontrolled. But now I had the strength and control needed to attempt it. I closed my eyes once more, allowing myself to focus entirely on the wind around me. The forest was alive with the subtle sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the soft whisper of the breeze as it moved through the trees. I needed to merge with it, to let my mana flow into the wind, not as a separate force but as part of the natural world. Vitaliera remained perched on my shoulder, her eyes watching me intently. "What are you doing, Lucavian?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of concern. She wasn't sure what I was attempting, and I could sense her uncertainty. "I'm trying to merge my mana with the wind," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's something my master taught me, a way to extend my senses beyond my physical body." At first, the process felt awkward, like trying to move a limb that had been asleep. My mana clashed with the natural flow of the wind, creating small disruptions in the air around me. But I persisted, focusing on the sensation of the breeze, on the way it moved through the forest. Slowly, I began to adjust, letting my mana seep into the air in a more natural, fluid manner. The wind responded, carrying my energy with it as it swirled through the trees. I could feel the way it brushed against the bark, the way it flowed through the leaves, the way it wrapped around the rocks, and the hidden creatures lurking in the shadows. The sensation was strange, just as I had imagined it years ago, but now it was real, tangible. Vitaliera, who had been observing in silence, suddenly shifted her stance, her tail flicking with interest. "I see," she murmured, a note of understanding in her voice. "You're using the wind to expand your senses. It's similar to what some monsters do, those who are deeply connected to the elements around them." Her words encouraged me, and I pushed further, extending my mana through the breeze. I could feel the physical forms of the creatures hidden within the rocky outcrop, their bodies solid and distinct, marked by the subtle disturbances they caused in the wind's flow. Every rock, every tree, every creature in the area became part of the intricate network of information the wind provided. "You're doing well," Vitaliera continued, her tone thoughtful as she analyzed my progress. "But be careful not to force it. The wind is a delicate element. It flows naturally, without resistance. Your mana should do the same. Let it blend with the breeze. Let it become the breeze. Let it become the breeze." Just as she said, I thought for a second. What was a breeze? A small amount of wind flowed. A small amount. Now then, I slowly understand what could be improved. The mana amount should be smaller, like a thread that is extending. I focused on my core, on the swirling energy within me. Instead of pushing out a large amount of mana, I began to release it in a thin, controlled stream. The mana flowed out like a thread, barely noticeable but enough to merge with the wind. Yes. Like this, I thought, feeling the difference immediately. The wind didn't resist this time. It accepted the thread of mana, weaving it into its flow as if it belonged there all along. The sensation was different now, smoother, more connected. The wind carried the thin thread of my mana, extending my senses further into the forest. I could feel the gentle rustle of leaves, the soft brush of the wind against the rocks, and, most importantly, the subtle disturbances caused by the creatures hiding within the shadows. Each one was distinct, their presence made clear by the way they interrupted the natural flow of the breeze. "That's it," Vitaliera said approvingly, sensing the change in my technique. "Now your mana moves with the wind, not against it. You've found the balance." So that was how it was, I thought. The technique was working, and I was beginning to understand how to use it effectively. It wasn't just about extending my senses. It was about becoming one with the wind, about letting my mana flow as naturally as the air around me. "I can feel them," I mumbled. "The creatures. They're hiding in the rocks, trying to blend in with the environment. But they can't hide from this." "Good," Vitaliera purred, her tone laced with satisfaction. "You're starting to see the world as it truly is." I nodded, focusing on the creatures I could now sense so clearly. "Let's start then." With a deep breath, I began to move, my steps silent and deliberate. The wind guided me, my mana thread still woven into its flow, keeping me connected to everything around me. I approached the first creature, a hulking beast with rough, stone-like skin, its body perfectly camouflaged against the rocky terrain. It hadn't noticed me yet, its attention focused elsewhere, but I could sense its readiness to pounce at the first sign of prey. From now on, the battlefield would go on. Chapter 82. Improving. In the days that followed, Lucavian's life became a cycle of relentless training and brutal combat. The shadowed thicket, with all its dangers, served as both his proving ground and his teacher. He moved through the forest like a phantom, his senses heightened by the wind technique he had finally begun to master. Each day, he ventured deeper into the territory of the forest's most fearsome creatures, pushing himself to his limits in an effort to hone his skills and grow stronger. The first beast he encountered after that initial rocky outcrop was a creature with skin as tough as stone, perfectly camouflaged against its surroundings. It was a predator lurking in the shadows, waiting for an unsuspecting victim to wander too close. But Lucavian was no ordinary prey. The wind whispered to him, guiding his movements and revealing the hidden dangers before they could strike. His first battle was fierce, the creature's strength formidable. Its stone-like skin deflected most of Lucavian's strikes, and its claws left deep gouges in the earth as it lunged at him. But Lucavian's movements were fluid and precise, and he used the terrain to his advantage. He darted between the rocks, striking at the creature's vulnerable spots, wearing it down little by little. Finally, with a well-timed thrust of his estoc, he pierced the beast's heart, and it collapsed with a thunderous crash. As it died, Lucavian felt the familiar coldness of death's mana rising from the corpse, and he absorbed it into his core, feeding the vortex that was the flame of Equinox. This became his routine. Each day he sought out new challenges, new creatures to test his strength against. The forest was teeming with life, and with every battle, Lucavian's connection to the flame of Equinox grew stronger. He hunted beasts of all kinds, massive wolves with razor-sharp fangs, serpentine creatures that slithered through the underbrush with lethal grace, and even monstrous birds that swooped down from the treetops with talons like steel. Every battle was a lesson. He learned to harness the flame of Equinox more effectively, to balance the chaos of the black flame with the order of the vortex. The white-hot fire of life, channeled through Vital Yara's guidance, continued to blend with the abyssal energy, creating a power that was as fierce as it was controlled. The technique was demanding, the energy wild and difficult to control, but Lucavian persevered. With each victory, he grew more attuned to the duality within him, and the vortex in his core became more defined and more stable. The layers of the vortex began to take shape, each one representing a deeper level of mastery over the flame of Equinox. His physical abilities also improved as his body adapted to the rigorous demands of the forest. His muscles grew stronger, his reflexes sharper. The constant battles honed his instincts, making him quicker and more efficient in combat. He learned to conserve his energy, to strike with precision rather than brute force, and to use his environment to his advantage. There were moments of pain, moments when the wild energy threatened to overwhelm him, and the chaos within the flame of Equinox surged out of control. But Vitaliera was always there, guiding him and helping him find the balance once more. Her presence was a steadying force, and her own recovery began to progress as well. Together, they explored the depths of the shadowed thicket, pushing further into its dangerous heart. They encountered creatures that tested the very limits of their strength. Beasts with venomous fangs, creatures with impenetrable hides, and even ancient predators that had claimed the forest as their own for centuries. But no matter how powerful the foe, Lucavian faced them all with the determination to grow stronger. With each battle, he absorbed more of the death mana, and the flame of Equinox continued to evolve. The black flame within him burned brighter, the vortex in his core spinning faster, more stable. Days turned into weeks, and the transformation was undeniable. Lucavian had become a force to be reckoned with, a warrior forged in the crucible of the forest's dangers. The young man who had once struggled to control his power was now a master of his own destiny, his connection to the flame of Equinox deep and unbreakable. The young man with slightly long hair walked beneath the dense canopy of the forest, his movements fluid and precise. His clothes, however, told a different story. They were haphazard, riddled with countless holes and tears, a testament to the battles he had fought and the dangers he had faced. The once sturdy fabric now hung loosely from his frame, the edges frayed and worn. Yet, despite the state of his attire, there was a sharpness to his presence, an aura of quiet strength and readiness. A long and thin sword rested in the sheath at his side, its hilt within easy reach of his hand. Lucavian's fingers hovered near the weapon, instinctively prepared to draw it at a moment's notice. The blade was his constant companion, a tool of survival, and a symbol of his mastery over the life and death forces within him. His face, in stark contrast to his battered clothing, was surprisingly clean. Despite the weeks spent in the wilderness, there was little sign of the harsh life he had endured. His skin was smooth, unmarred by dirt or stubble, as if he had somehow managed to maintain a semblance of order amid the chaos. His hair, which had grown longer during his time in the forest, was neatly tied behind his head in a ponytail, keeping it out of his eyes and giving him a focused, determined appearance. Surrounding him was a faint, slightly purplish energy, a manifestation of the devourer of the stars, his master's legacy. It pulsed gently around him. The energy was a testament to the power he had cultivated, the mastery he had achieved over the forces that had once threatened to tear him apart. As he walked forward, the energy swirled subtly around him, a reminder of the strength that now resided within his core. Beside him, a sleek and agile cat bounded through the underbrush, her movements graceful and almost playful. Vitaliera had regained much of her former vitality, her fur gleaming with health. The wounds that had once marred her body were healed, and there was a brightness in her eyes that spoke of renewed strength. She leaped effortlessly from rock to rock, her body a blur of motion as she explored their surroundings. Her presence was no longer that of a wounded, desperate creature, but of a proud and powerful guardian. The bond between her and Lucavian had only grown stronger, and she seemed to revel in the freedom and strength that the forest had restored to her. "Let's find something to eat," Lucavian said, his voice calm and measured as he surveyed the forest with sharp, discerning eyes. "Are you planning to challenge it now?" In his head, a voice echoed as the cat stopped her tracks to look at him. "Indeed, after filling my stomach." "Are you sure?" "I am." Lucavian's gaze remained steady as he spoke, his voice tinged with determination. "After spending the last few months training, I've developed the flame of Equinox to its maximum potential. I'm almost ready to form the first vortex." Vitaliera paused, her sharp eyes studying him intently. "But in the past 3 weeks, all your attempts have met with failure, haven't they?" she asked, her tone more thoughtful than accusatory. He nodded slowly. "Yes. At first, I couldn't understand why I kept hitting a wall, why the vortex refused to fully form. But then, after countless failed attempts, I realized the reason." "And what did you discover?" Vitaliera inquired, though she already had an inkling of what his answer might be. Lucavian's expression grew resolute as he continued, "The monsters I've been hunting, the death mana they leave behind is simply not enough. It lacks the intensity and chaos needed to push me past the threshold. The first vortex requires more than just quantity. It demands a chaotic force, a raw power that can only be found in something truly strong, something that challenges the very limits of my strength." Vitaliera's gaze sharpened, and she nodded in understanding. "So that is why you are planning to challenge it now?" "Exactly," Lucavian affirmed. "The creatures I've faced so far were formidable, but they weren't enough. If I want to succeed in forming the first vortex, I need to hunt something with a massive amount of mana, something that can provide the level of chaos required for the vortex to fully take shape." He paused for a moment, raising his head to see the place. Lucavian lifted his gaze toward the towering peak of the mountain ahead, his eyes narrowing as he took in the formidable terrain. The summit was jagged and rough, with craggy rocks jutting out like the fangs of some ancient beast. The air was thin here, and the wind howled around the stones, carrying with it a biting chill that cut through even his thick clothes. The mountain's peak was surrounded by an almost otherworldly aura, a sense of foreboding that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. There, Nestled at the very top was a small crater, a shallow depression in the earth that looked as if it had been gouged out by a tremendous force. The edges of the crater were lined with sharp rocks, and within its depths, a strange, pulsating light could be seen, faintly illuminating the otherwise barren landscape. Lucavian knew what lay within that crater. The creature he sought, the one that would provide him with the chaos and mana he needed, resided there. It was a beast that had been marked on his map. Lesser Abyssal WYRM. Chapter 83. The Boss Monster. Lesser Abyssal WYRM, Lucavian repeated, the name rolling off his tongue like a challenge issued to the world itself. Vitaliera glanced at him, her eyes narrowing with concern. Are you certain about this, Lucavian? The Abyssal WYRM isn't just any monster. It's a peak 3-star creature at the very pinnacle of power in this part of the forest. Even with all the progress you've made, this fight will be different. Being one of the mythical monsters, Vitaliera had recovered a part of her strength. But it was only a fraction of it, as they had yet to find any life-concentrated locations. But there was something that she could provide even without her strength returning. It was her knowledge of monsters. With how she had lived in the forest, she was exceptionally knowledgeable about the monsters with life and death attributes, especially the monsters of Abyss. Lucavian nodded, his expression resolute. I know, Vitaliera. I've been avoiding the Shattered Veil for that very reason. The creatures there are on a different level, most of them rumored to be at least 4-star strength. But this area, I've pushed myself here, but it's no longer enough. I need a true challenge if I'm going to break through. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he continued. I've cleared out most of the monsters in this part of the forest. The fights have become too predictable, too easy. I don't want to get arrogant, but I need something that will push me to my limits. The Abyssal WYRM is that challenge. Lucavian's eyes gleamed with determination as he added, the Abyssal WYRM is a creature of the Abyss, Vitaliera. If what you've told me is true, then there's a chance I can absorb its energy, or at the very least, the death energy in that place must be stronger. The Abyssal WYRM might be exactly what I need to complete the first vortex. Vitaliera remained silent for a moment, her gaze sharp as she assessed Lucavian's words. You're right about that, she finally said. The Abyssal WYRM's connection to the Abyss means it's surrounded by powerful death energy. If you can survive the battle and absorb that energy, it could provide the catalyst you need. Lucavian nodded, feeling a sense of anticipation building within him. That's what I'm counting on. I've been preparing for this, and now it's time to put everything to the test. Sigh. A heavy sigh echoed in his head. As expected, Vitaliera did not want him to force himself to do such a thing, and that was understandable. After all, knowing that she had once lost her contractor, she would not want the same thing to happen again. But at the same time, Lucavian was not someone that would back away. Once he made the decision, that would be the end of it, especially after learning that the monster there was Lesser Abyssal WYRM. Anyway, let's not think about that for the time being. I need to fill my stomach first. You are also hungry, no? Deciding to lighten the mood a little, Lucavian smiled. What do you want to eat? I will treat you what you want. Vitaliera looked up at Lucavian with a gleam in her eyes. If you're offering, then I'd like to eat a stormclaw hare. Lucavian blinked, a chuckle escaping his lips. A stormclaw hare? Huh? You don't make things easy, do you? Those are tricky to catch, and they live quite a distance from here. But if that's what you want, I'll get it for you. Stormclaw hares were known for their incredible speed and agility, making them difficult prey even for seasoned hunters. They were also quite rare, their habitats usually being deep within the forest's most treacherous terrains. The effort required to capture one was considerable, but Lucavian wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially not when it came to fulfilling a promise to his companion. You asked for it, Vitaliera responded, her tone teasing yet appreciative. But you should know they're delicious. The energy they contain is refreshing, even for a being like me. All right, Lucavian said with a smile. Let's get moving then. They made their way through the forest, and Lucavian's steps were quick and deliberate as he navigated the terrain. He had become intimately familiar with the layout of this part of the forest, and it didn't take long for him to find the area where the stormclaw hares were known to reside. As he approached the dense thicket where the hares were most likely hiding, Lucavian closed his eyes and allowed his mana to flow into the wind. Over the past weeks of intense training, he had honed this technique to near perfection. His mana merged seamlessly with the breeze, spreading out like a fine web, detecting the slightest disturbances in the air. The forest seemed to come alive around him as his senses extended. The rustle of leaves, the scurrying of small animals, the subtle shifts in the wind, all of it became part of his awareness. And then he felt it, the faint but distinct presence of a stormclaw hare, its rapid heartbeat and quick movements giving it away. There you are, he thought, a satisfied smile tugging at his lips. Moving with the stealth he had painstakingly perfected, Lucavian approached the hare's location. He kept his presence low, his mana barely a whisper in the air, ensuring that the creature wouldn't sense him until it was too late. When he was close enough, he stopped and focused on his core, drawing upon the energy within. He channeled it into his estoc, the blade beginning to glow faintly with a soft, silver light. Void Starfall Blade, Starlight Needle. Swoosh! With a swift, precise motion, he released the condensed beam of starlight, a thin, almost invisible ray of energy that shot forward like a needle. Thud! The beam struck the stormclaw hare before it even had a chance to react, piercing its heart in an instant. The creature collapsed, lifeless, before it even realized it was being hunted. Ha! Lucavian let out a breath, lowering his blade as he approached the fallen hare. That was easier than I thought, he said with a grin, picking up the creature and examining it. The hare's body was still warm, its fur soft and unmarred by any visible wound. Impressive, Vitaliera commented, her voice carrying a note of approval. You've gotten even better at this. That was quite expected. After all, he had all the time to focus on his Void Starfall blade and his swordsmanship. Lucavian shrugged modestly. I've had a lot of practice. Plus, it's nice to see that the techniques Master taught me are really paying off. With the techniques that his master left behind with his old companion beside him, it was easy to get feedback. What do you think of my performance? How was it compared to Master? Vitaliera finished her meal and looked up at Lucavian, her eyes filled with a mix of nostalgia and critical analysis. Your performance was good, Lucavian, no doubt about it. But if you're asking me to compare you to Gerald, well, you still have a ways to go. Lucavian raised an eyebrow, curious but not surprised. Oh? How so? Gerald? Vitaliera began, her voice tinged with a mix of admiration and fondness. Could have taken down that stormclaw hare without even drawing his blade. He had a way of using his mana so efficiently, so precisely, that his presence alone could overwhelm creatures like this. He could manipulate the air, the earth, everything around him until his target had no choice but to surrender. Lucavian chuckled, shaking his head. That's something only someone at the 4-star level could achieve. I'm not quite there yet. No, Gerald would have done it even while being a 3-star. That means he was a mage? Kind of. I see. Then does that mean Master did not teach me the complete technique he had used? Most likely. He has a talent for using mana. No, it was not a normal talent. He was the greatest genius that I had ever seen. Not that you are too much different, she thought but did not say it outright. Because of his talent, he was able to use such a different mana that nobody in the world had used. But your condition is unique just like him, so most likely he had altered the technique to teach you. Lucavian considered Vitaliara's words carefully. So, Master modified his technique for me? That makes sense. He always had a way of tailoring his teachings to fit the individual. Indeed, Vitaliera responded. Gerald understood that no two people are the same, especially when it comes to mana manipulation. His ability to adapt most likely results in his ability to teach you. He knew that your reversed mana meridians made you different, so he adjusted the techniques accordingly. Lucavian nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. I've always wondered why certain aspects of the technique felt like they were tailored just for me. Now I understand why. But don't think that means you're lacking in any way, Vitaliera added quickly. On the contrary, it means that Gerald saw something in you, something special, just like he had. Your unique condition might be challenging, but it also gives you the potential that others don't have. Especially that sword in your hand. Even Gerald would never win against you if you just clashed swords. She looked at the sword. There were countless different marks on it, showing countless battles it had endured. Yet the sword stood there. Lucavian smiled faintly, the weight of his master's teachings settling on his shoulders. I know. After all, his master was the first person to start believing him for the potential he held. That is why I will not disappoint him. With that, he stood up. After all, he had already filled his stomach as well. Let's go. You have already finished your meal. You really are eager to go. I am. As Lucavian and Vitaliera began their ascent toward the peak where the lesser abyssal WIRM resided, the atmosphere around them gradually shifted, becoming darker and more foreboding. The path was rugged and treacherous, lined with jagged rocks that jutted out at odd angles, forcing them to navigate carefully to avoid slipping or cutting themselves on the sharp edges. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, carrying with it a sense of dread that seemed to intensify with every step they took. It was as if the very mountain itself was warning them of the danger that lay ahead. As they climbed higher, Lucavian's sharp eyes caught sight of something scattered along the path. Carcasses and skeletons of various monsters, some fresh, others little more than bleached bones. The remains were strewn across the rocky terrain, a grim reminder of the power of the creature they were about to face. Vitaliera, perched on his shoulder, gazed at the scene with a mix of wariness and recognition. The abyssal WRM's territory, she murmured. It's marking its domain, warning others to stay away. These creatures were likely foolish enough to challenge it and paid the ultimate price. Lucavian nodded, his expression serious as he surveyed the display of strength. But then he smirked. A mere beast dares to create a territory. I can't wait to trample on its neck once I kill it. His smirk was wide. Sigh, he really changed personality once again. Vitaliera couldn't help but cringe. Chapter 84. The Boss Monster. 2. A mere beast dares to create a territory. I can't wait to trample on its neck once I kill it. As Lucavian continued his ascent, his smirk only widened, a sharp contrast to the serious demeanor he had just displayed moments ago. His eyes, usually filled with determination, now gleamed with a fierce, almost predatory light. His hand rested confidently on the hilt of his estoc, the weapon that had become an extension of himself, a symbol of his growing power and relentless ambition. Vitaliera, perched on his shoulder, observed the transformation with a mix of concern and understanding. She had seen this change in him before, this shift in his demeanor, this surge of arrogance that seemed to take hold whenever he prepared for battle. It was as if the act of facing an enemy, the thrill of combat, awakened something primal within him. You've changed again, she noted, her voice tinged with a resigned sigh. It's as if you become a different person the moment you grab your sword. Lucavian's smirk deepened, his eyes narrowing with a sharp, confident edge. When I face an opponent, I don't just fight to win, he replied, his voice low and intense. I fight to dominate. His steps were deliberate, each one resonating with the confidence of a man who knew his own strength and relished in the thought of proving it. The carcasses and bones that littered the path were no longer just signs of danger. To Lucavian, they were the trophies of his soon-to-be victory, the evidence of his impending conquest. You really do change when you're like this. Vitaliera mused her tone, a mix of exasperation and a hint of admiration. You become arrogant. Lucavian's eyes flashed with fierce pride. Arrogance is only a flaw if you can't back it up, he said, his grip tightening on the hilt of his estoc. And considering I am alive till this point, things do seem like they are not working against me. Vitaliera couldn't deny that there was truth in his words. She had witnessed his growth, seen the way he had honed his skills and refined his techniques. Lucavian was no longer the uncertain young man she had first met. He had become a warrior, one who embraced the challenges before him with a boldness that bordered on recklessness. "Just be careful," she advised, her voice softening slightly. "The abyssal WYRM is not like the other monsters you've faced. It's a creature of pure abyssal energy, and its strength is formidable. Don't let your confidence blind you to the danger." Lucavian's smirk softened into a determined smile, a flicker of his more familiar self shining through. "I'm not blind to the danger. So you feel fear. Those who don't feel fear when facing an enemy are the ones who die first." That is what I had learned from the battlefield. Vitaliera couldn't help but shake her head, her tail flicking slightly in exasperation. "You talk as if you've seen it all, Lucavian." Lucavian's smile remained, but there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes, something that spoke of past battles and hard-won experiences. "I may not have seen it all, but I've seen enough." Rumble. Before Vitaliera could respond, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Screech. The air was suddenly filled with a screech that echoed through the mountains, a sound that sent a chill down even Lucavian's spine. The atmosphere grew tense, the foreboding presence of something powerful drawing closer. Schlink. Without hesitation, Lucavian's hand moved to his estoc, the blade flashing in the dim light as he drew it from its sheath. His senses sharpened, every muscle in his body tensing in preparation for the inevitable confrontation. Swoso. From one of the carcasses scattered along the path, something dark and swift launched itself toward him with a feral snarl, a shadow stalker, its eyes gleaming with predatory intent. Tisk. Lucavian's response was instantaneous. His estoc moved in a blur, the blade slicing through the air with precision honed by countless battles. Slash. There was a brief moment of resistance as the steel met flesh, and then the shadow stalker's momentum faltered. Thud. The beast landed heavily on the ground, its body split cleanly in two by the force of Lucavian's strike. Twitched once, then lay still, its blood pooling around it. As expected, there are always some parasites wandering around like this. You indeed got stronger. Lucavian sheathed his estoc, his gaze never leaving the direction of the abyssal WRM's lair. "Strength alone isn't enough," he replied. "It's about knowing when to strike, how to use the opponent's own momentum against them. That's what keeps you alive." As the echoes of the screech faded, the mountains seemed to fall into an uneasy silence, as if the very land itself was holding its breath. But then, as if triggered by some unseen force, the stillness of the mountain was shattered by a deafening roar that echoed through the craggy peaks. The sound was deep and resonant, a powerful, guttural bellow that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was the unmistakable cry of the abyssal WYRM. Screech. Lucavian paused, his eyes narrowing as he listened to the beast's roar. The beast. There was a familiarity in that sound, something primal that stirred deep within him. "It is challenging me," he said, a grim smile forming on his lips. Vitaliera looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "How do you know that?" Lucavian didn't turn to face her. His gaze remained fixed on the direction from which the roar had come. "I can feel it," he said quietly, his voice steady. "It's something I've always felt when I'm about to face an opponent alone. It's like a call, an invitation to a duel." Vitaliera could sense the intensity in Lucavian's demeanor, the way his entire being seemed to resonate with the energy of the impending battle. "You've felt this before?" she asked, her tone curious but also concerned. Lucavian nodded. "Every time I've faced a strong opponent, I've felt this connection. It's like the world narrows down to just me and them. There's nothing else, no distractions, no doubts. Just the fight. You really are something. Master also scolded me a lot. But then, he did not have any choice but to accept it. Gerald did. He did. But what can I do?" Lucavian smiled. "This is what makes me who I am." With that, he reached the top of the mountain, his step steady and sure as he neared the summit. The wind howled around him, carrying with it the scent of blood and decay, a grim reminder of the countless lives that had been lost on this unforgiving peak. As he took his final steps onto the plateau, the sight that greeted him was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Before him lay a massive crater, its edges jagged and rough, as if the earth itself had been torn apart by some colossal force. The crater was filled with the remnants of past battles. Countless skeletons and carcasses littered the ground, the remains of monsters that had once roamed this mountain. The bones were bleached white by the elements, their hollow eyes staring up at the sky as if in eternal lament. But it wasn't just the sheer number of remains that caught Lucavian's attention. Scattered throughout the crater were massive thorns, each one as thick as a man's arm and as tall as a tree. These thorns jutted out from the ground at odd angles, skewering the skulls of fallen beasts. The sight was both macabre and imposing, a clear indication that this place was not meant for the living. Vitalyara's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. "This is the WRM's lair," she murmured, her voice tense. "Those thorns, they're not natural. They're the WRM's doing, a manifestation of its abyssal energy. This creature doesn't just kill. It revels in death, in the suffering of its prey." Lucavian's expression remained calm as he surveyed the area. The abyssal energy here was palpable, a heavy presence that weighed down on him like a thick fog. But rather than intimidating him, it made him feel like he was in his home. This was the challenge he had been seeking, the ultimate test of his strength and his mastery of the flame of Equinox. "This is it," Lucavian said, his voice low but firm. "The abyssal WYRM is close. I can feel its presence, watching us." He stepped closer to the edge of the crater, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Are you angry that I stepped into your territory?" The thorns, the bones, the aura of death that hung over this place, as if to remind him that he was now in the beast's presence. "Well, if there are no contestants like me, you will have no choice but to hunt down. So, please don't be angry." As Lucavian's words faded into the wind, the silence of the mountain was shattered by a sudden, ear-piercing screech that reverberated through the air. Before he could react, a massive shadow loomed over him, and the ground beneath his feet trembled violently. Screech. The beast made its appearance. Chapter 85. Lesser Abyssal WYRM. Screech. The Lesser Abyssal WYRM burst forth from the depths of the crater, its massive body moving with a speed that belied its size. The creature was a terrifying sight to behold. Its scales glistened with an oily black sheen, and its eyes burned with a malevolent crimson light. The WRM's maw opened wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth as it lunged toward Lucavian with a ferocious snarl. Slam! The force of the WRM's strike sent Lucavian flying backward, his body crashing into the jagged rocks at the edge of the crater. Pain exploded in his chest as the impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment, the world spun in a dizzying blur. Damn fast! Lucavian gritted his teeth, struggling to regain his footing as the WRM coiled its massive body around the crater, its movements swift and fluid. The creature's sheer size and speed were overwhelming, and it was clear that this was no ordinary opponent. The WRM was a creature born of the abyss, a force of pure, unrelenting power. Lucavian raised his estoc just in time to block another strike from the WRM's tail, the impact sending shockwaves through his arms. The force of the blow drove him to one knee, and he could feel the pressure of the WRM's attack bearing down on him. "Lucavian!" Vitalyara's voice rang out in his mind, a mix of urgency and concern. "This is no ordinary foe. You must be careful." "I know," Lucavian muttered through gritted teeth, his eyes narrowing as he studied the WRM's movements. The creature was relentless, its attacks coming from all angles with a speed that left little room for error. The WRM lunged again, its jaws snapping shut with a deafening crash mere inches from Lucavian's face. He rolled to the side, barely avoiding the creature's deadly bite, and quickly countered with a swift strike to the WRM's exposed side. Clang! The blade of his estoc met the WRM's scales with a sharp metallic clang, but it barely left a scratch. The WRM's armor was far tougher than he had anticipated, and his weapon seemed almost ineffective against the creature's hardened hide. "Its scales are too thick," Vitalyara warned, her voice tinged with frustration. You need to find a weak spot. Sigh. At that moment, a heavy sigh escaped from his mouth. Vitaliera, please be quiet. Vitaliera was taken aback by Lucavian's sudden command, her eyes widening in surprise. Huh! She blinked, her voice filled with confusion and concern. But Lucavian didn't waver. His expression hardened, his focus sharpening as he fixed his gaze on the WRM. I need to focus, he said, his voice low and intense. This is a one-on-one fight. Don't interrupt me. There was a finality to his words, a determination that left no room for argument. Vitaliera felt a pang of guilt, realizing that she had been unintentionally disrupting his concentration. She had seen this side of Lucavian before, the unyielding focus, the singular drive to overcome his opponent without distraction. She sighed inwardly, her tail flicking with a mixture of resignation and understanding. You're right, she admitted. I'll stay quiet. Just be careful. Though she also noted what he said, that was for another time, not now. Lucavian didn't respond immediately. His entire being was now honed in on the WIRM, his mind working at a rapid pace to analyze every movement, every opening. The heavy sigh he had let out earlier seemed to have released the last of his tension, leaving behind only a razor-sharp focus. Vitaliera watched him in silence, her usual commentary withheld. She knew Lucavian well enough to understand that when he entered this state, there was no breaking through. He was in his element now, and the best thing she could do was to trust him. Swoosh! The WIRM lunged again, its massive form moving with terrifying speed, but Lucavian was ready. A blackish-colored starlight started oozing from him. His eyes, which were usually pitch black, were now filled with a purplish light. Void Starfall Blade, Star Surge. The blade moved with fluid grace, slicing through the air as if it were an extension of Lucavian's very soul. The WIRM, undeterred by the change in its opponent, lunged forward with another ferocious strike, its jaws snapping shut with enough force to crush stone. I can already see that, but Lucavian was faster this time with his reaction. His estoc, now imbued with the power of the Void Starfall Blade, danced in his hands, the starlight trailing behind each movement like a comet streaking across the night sky. Clang! The blade met the WRM scales, and this time the impact was different. The starlight-infused estoc sliced through the air with a sharp, resonant note, its edge cutting through the WRM's armor with a precision that defied logic. Sparks flew as the blade met resistance, but it pressed on, carving a deep gash into the WRM's side. Screech! The creature let out a deafening roar of pain, its massive body writhing as it tried to shake off the attack. But Lucavian was relentless. He pressed forward, his movements fluid and controlled, each strike of the Void Starfall Blade, delivered with lethal accuracy. Void Starfall Blade. Eclipse Star Trail. He whispered the command under his breath, and the starlight around him intensified. The blade in his hand began to pulse with energy, the light condensing into a concentrated point at the tip. With a powerful thrust, Lucavian drove the blade forward, the starlight exploding outward in a burst of raw, destructive force. Slash! The WIRM's tough scales were no match for the concentrated power of the Eclipse Star Trail, as the whole amount of energy was compressed right on the tip. After all, there was a reason why estoc was thin and long. Stab! The blade pierced through the creature's armor, sinking deep into its flesh. The WIRM let out another ear-splitting screech, its body convulsing as the energy from the starlight surged through it, disrupting its very essence. The technique was meant to disturb the enemy's internal energy. Lucavian could feel the raw power of the starlight coursing through the creature, but before he could press the advantage, a sudden tremor beneath his feet caught his attention. Something is coming. The ground trembled violently, and Lucavian's sharpened battlefield senses screamed a warning. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His instincts, honed by countless battles, told him that his life was in imminent danger. Without a moment's hesitation, Lucavian yanked his estoc from the WRM's flesh, the blade sliding free with a wet, sickening sound. In the same motion, He planted his foot against the creature's side and kicked off, channeling a burst of starlight through his body to propel himself backward. Boom! The blast of starlight was more powerful than he had anticipated. It sent him hurtling through the air at breakneck speed, his body moving faster than he could control. The force of the explosion left him disoriented, and for a brief moment, everything was a blur of light and sound. But his decision had been the right one. As he tumbled through the air, Lucavian caught sight of the spot where he had just been standing. There, jutting out of the ground like a forest of deadly spears, were a series of massive, jagged skewers made of dark, abyssal energy. They had erupted from the earth with terrifying speed, their razor-sharp tips gleaming with a malevolent light. Had he stayed even a fraction of a second longer, those skewers would have impaled him, ending the fight in an instant. Lucavian twisted in the air, managing to regain some control as he braced for impact. He hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the shock before coming to a stop. His chest heaved as he caught his breath, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Ha! As expected, you will not go down without a fight. Well, that is befitting to the lord of this mountain, is it not?" He laughed, but there was no time to rest. The lesser abyssal Wyrm was far from defeated. The creature rose from the ground, its body writhing with abyssal energy. The wounds inflicted by the Eclipse Star Trail still bled, but the Wyrm's regeneration had already begun, dark energy knitting its flesh back together. Its eyes burned with a vengeful fury, and the ground beneath it seemed to pulse with the same malevolent force. "Hey! Don't get mad. Why are you angry?" Lucavian's gaze narrowed as he assessed the situation. The Wyrm wasn't just a mindless beast. It was cunning, capable of using its abyssal energy to manipulate the battlefield. Growl. The Wyrm let out a low, guttural growl, its form shifting as more of the abyssal energy gathered around it. The skewers that had erupted from the ground began to retract, melting back into the earth like shadows retreating from the light. But Lucavian wasn't about to be caught off guard again. His grip tightened on the hilt of his estoc, the blade still glowing faintly with the remnants of starlight. "If I want to keep myself from getting cornered, I need to stay on the move." The creature lunged again, its movements fluid and predatory. Lucavian darted to the side, his eyes locked on the Wyrm's every move. Lucavian's mind raced as he searched for an opening. The Wyrm is regearing, but this process will take time. The damage to the Eclipse Star Trail cannot be easily recovered. The starlight should still be messing with his insides. If he could find a way to exploit that delay, to strike at the heart of the abyssal energy fueling the creature, he might be able to end this once and for all. That is the right way. To do that, I need to create an opening. In his mind, slowly the outline of the battle started forming. Chapter 86. Lesser Abyssal Wyrm 2. Lucavian's mind was a whirlwind of calculations as the lesser abyssal Wyrm shifted its tactics. The creature's regeneration was remarkable, but it was only a matter of time before Lucavian would find the opening he needed. The battle was now a deadly game of patience and precision, where the slightest mistake could mean his end. The Wyrm, sensing that brute force alone would not be enough, shifted its approach. Its massive form began to tremble, and a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the air. Lucavian's eyes narrowed, his instincts screaming a warning. "It's preparing something big." Without warning, the Wyrm reared back, its maw gaping wide. A seething mass of dark energy began to gather in its throat, coalescing into a dense, swirling vortex. The very air around Lucavian seemed to thrum with power as the Wyrm unleashed its breath, an inferno of abyssal fire. Whoosh! The black flames erupted from the Wyrm's jaws, sweeping across the crater like a tidal wave of death. The heat was intense, the very ground beneath Lucavian's feet beginning to melt and crack under the assault. Devourer of stars. Manifest. There was no time to think, only react. Lucavian summoned every ounce of starlight within him, forming a protective barrier around his body as he leaped backward. The barrier held, but the force of the flames drove him further back, his feet skidding across the scorched earth. Despite the protection, he could feel the searing heat piercing through, licking at his skin and burning away the edges of his clothes. This fire, it's not normal. It's devouring everything, even mana itself. The realization struck him hard. This was no ordinary fire. So, that is what she meant by the essence of abyss. The abyssal flames were consuming not just the physical world but the very essence of energy itself. Lucavian knew that he couldn't afford to take another direct hit like that. But the WYRM wasn't finished. As the flames died down, a thick, impenetrable fog began to rise from the ground, blanketing the entire battlefield. The fog was unnatural, an eerie blend of darkness and shadow that seemed to swallow all light. Lucavian's vision blurred, his senses dulled by the oppressive miasma. A smokescreen? Or something more? Lucavian's mind raced as he tried to pierce through the fog with his senses. But it wasn't just his sight that was impaired. The fog seemed to distort sound, distance, and even his perception of time. It was as if the WYRM had drawn him into a world where the rules of reality no longer applied. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him trembled violently. Lucavian's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. The WYRM had disappeared into the earth, its massive body burrowing through the ground like a serpent. The tremors grew stronger, more erratic, as the creature wormed its way beneath him, ready to strike from any direction. This is bad. He barely had time to react before the ground exploded beneath him. The WRM's massive head burst forth, its jaws snapping shut with bone-crushing force. Swoosh! Lucavian twisted his body at the last second, narrowly avoiding being bitten in half, but the creature's tail whipped around with blinding speed, catching him in the side. Thud! Ugh! The impact sent Lucavian flying through the air, his body slamming into the jagged rocks at the crater's edge. Pain radiated through his ribs, and he tasted blood in his mouth. The world tilted precariously as he struggled to stay conscious. Lucavian! Vitalyara's voice echoed in his mind, a mix of panic and concern. But she held back, remembering his earlier command. Lucavian coughed, spitting out a mouthful of blood as he forced himself to his feet. His body ached, and every breath was a struggle, but his eyes remained focused and sharp. Focus! I need to focus. The WYRM had burrowed back into the ground, and the fog still hung thick around him, obscuring his vision. But in that moment of clarity, Lucavian realized something. There was a pattern to the WYRM's movements. The tremors, the shifts in the ground, the way the fog moved. It all followed a rhythm, a cadence that he had almost overlooked in the heat of battle. It's using the fog to mask its approach, but the ground gives it away. Lucavian closed his eyes, shutting out everything but the subtle vibrations beneath his feet. He focused on the rhythm, the slight changes in pressure, the way the earth shifted ever so slightly as the WYRM moved. There, I've got you. He opened his eyes, now filled with a fierce energy. The WYRM was cunning, but it wasn't invincible. Lucavian had seen through its tricks and had grasped the rhythm of its attacks. And now he knew what to do. The ground trembled again, and Lucavian's body tensed, ready to spring into action. The vibrations grew stronger and closer, and he could sense the WYRM rising up beneath him, ready to strike. Now! Lucavian leaped to the side just as the ground exploded once more. The WRM's head shot out of the earth, its jaws snapping shut where he had just been standing. But this time, Lucavian was ready. He pivoted on his heel, his estoc already in motion, the blade glowing with concentrated starlight. Take this! He drove the blade forward, aiming not for the WRM's armor but for a specific point, an exposed area near the base of its skull where the abyssal energy converged. The void starfall blade struck true, the starlight-infused estoc piercing through the WRM's thick hide and sinking deep into its flesh. Screech! The WYRM let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing violently as the energy from the starlight surged through it. But Lucavian didn't stop. He twisted the blade, driving it deeper, channeling more starlight into the wound. Got you now. The WRM thrashed and writhed, but its movements were growing weaker, more erratic. The fog began to dissipate, and the tremors in the ground lessened. Lucavian could feel the abyssal energy waning, its hold on the creature slipping. Screech! But just as he was about to dispel more energy, the creature screeched once more, a sound that reverberated through the very air, filled with desperate fury. Lucavian's instincts screamed at him, a primal warning that something far more dangerous was coming. The WRM's body convulsed violently, its scales beginning to shimmer with an eerie, malevolent light. Lucavian's eyes narrowed as he watched the creature's last-ditch effort to survive. The scales, once smooth and impervious, began to tip upwards, standing on end like rows of deadly blades. The air around the WRM crackled with energy as the beast prepared its final strike. It's going to self-destruct? Lucavian's mind raced, but there was no time to react. The WRM's entire body began to shake, and with one final, deafening screech, it unleashed its ultimate attack. The scales shot out in all directions like a storm of razors, each one glowing with the abyssal energy that had once fueled the beast's life. The sheer number of scales filled the air, each one honed to a deadly edge. Lucavian knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was something he could not simply evade. His instincts, honed by countless battles, told him that this attack was all-encompassing, leaving no room for escape. There's no dodging this. Lucavian closed his eyes, his mind reaching a state of perfect clarity. He could feel the energy around him, the currents of power swirling through the air as the scales bore down on him. Slowly, deliberately, he pointed his estoc to the side, the blade steady in his grasp. Lucavian! Vital Yara's voice rang out in his mind, frantic and filled with fear. What are you doing? The scales. They're coming straight for you. But Lucavian remained calm, even with his breathing. A small, almost imperceptible circle of starlight began to form around him, its light soft yet unwavering. The scales drew closer, a storm of death descending upon him from all sides. I have to trust in this. Lucavian released his breath, his body relaxing into the stance. The circle of starlight around him solidified, glowing brighter as he centered himself within it. And then, with a quiet resolve, he spoke the name of his technique. Annihilation Sword. Null-spaced. The moment the words left his lips, the circle of starlight flared with a sudden turning into a black-grayish hue. The scales, now mere inches from his body, entered the circle, and in that instant, they were met with an invisible force. Clank, 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 clank. Each scale that crossed the boundary was cut down with surgical precision and disintegrated into nothingness before it could touch him. The air around Lucavian was filled with the sound of metal clashing against an unseen barrier, a symphony of destruction as the scales were obliterated one by one. The starlight within the circle hummed with power, its glow unwavering as it annihilated everything that dared to enter. Vitaliera watched in awe and disbelief as the storm of scales was neutralized, her mind struggling to comprehend the sheer mastery of the technique. Incredible! He's cutting them all down. Lucavian remained motionless within the circle, his focus absolute. His breathing was calm and measured. At least that was how it looked from the outside. Upon close inspection, he was actually moving at a rapid speed and cutting everything that was coming his way. That was a technique he had developed on his own just by himself. The sword style that he had used as Bruce. It was the manifestation of that sword. The WRM's final attack, a last-ditch effort to take him down, was reduced to nothing more than dust in the wind. When the last of the scales had been destroyed, the circle of starlight slowly faded, leaving Lucavian standing alone in the aftermath. The WRM's massive form slumped to the ground, utterly spent. Yet the beast did not die. Of course, it would not. After all, no beast would sacrifice itself just for the sake of taking its enemy along. They had only one instinct. It was to survive. Well, that was close. As the adrenaline of battle faded, exhaustion began to take hold. His body, pushed to its absolute limits, was starting to show the toll of his relentless efforts. Blood trickled from his nose, a dark crimson trail that dripped onto the ground. He could feel the sharp pain in his muscles, the deep ache in his bones, signs of the internal injuries he had sustained from forcing his body to perform a technique that was not yet complete. Vitalyara's concerned voice echoed in his mind. "Lucavian, you're hurt. You've got internal injuries." He nodded slightly, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Yeah, I know. The technique. It's not finished. I pushed myself too hard." His breaths were shallow and labored, each one sending a jolt of pain through his chest. But despite the pain, a smirk played on his lips as he looked down at the W-worm. The once mighty creature, now slumped and defeated, still clung to life, its body trembling with the last vestiges of its strength. How sad. Chapter 87, First Vortex. How sad. Lucavian mumbled as he stepped closer, his eyes cold and mocking. "In the end, you ended up just like these," he said, pointing to the skulls all around. "And now you are going to become my meal." The lesser abyssal WYRM, now stripped of its once impenetrable scales, lay exposed and vulnerable before Lucavian. Its flesh, pale and almost translucent, pulsed with the last remnants of the abyssal energy that had once made it so fearsome. Without its protective armor, the creature no longer looked like the mighty beast that had terrorized the forest. Its body was long and sinuous, covered in patches of raw, bleeding flesh where the scales had been torn away. The WYRM's eyes, once glowing with a malevolent light, were now dull and glazed, filled with a mixture of pain and fear. The creature's elongated maw, lined with jagged, broken teeth, gaped open as it struggled to breathe. Its massive claws, which had once raked through the earth with terrifying force, now twitched weakly, scraping against the rocky ground in a pitiful attempt to defend its. Lucavian watched the WRM's futile efforts with a detached expression, the coldness in his eyes reflecting the fate that awaited the beast. It was no longer a monster to be feared. It was just a pest, a dying creature that had been stripped of its power and dignity. The sight of the wriggling, pitiful mass before him stirred no sympathy in Lucavian. Instead, it only solidified his resolve. "As a mere beast, you have already achieved quite a lot," Lucavian said with a smirk, his voice mocking. He raised his estoc, the blade gleaming in the dim light, and took a step closer to the WRM. "But in the end, you became nothing but a stepping stone." The WRM's body convulsed, a final, desperate spasm of life as Lucavian approached. Its tail lashed out one last time, but the movement was slow and weak, easily avoided. Lucavian didn't flinch. His focus was absolute, his mind clear as he prepared to deliver the final blow. With a swift, decisive motion, Lucavian plunged his estoc deep into the WYRM's exposed flesh, aiming for the creature's heart. The blade sank in smoothly, meeting little resistance as it pierced through muscle and bone. The WYRM let out a final, shuddering gasp, its body going still as the last of its life force drained away. Lucavian watched as the light faded from the WRM's eyes, the once terrifying beast reduced to nothing more than a lifeless husk. He pulled his blade free, wiping it clean on the creature's pale flesh before stepping back. "It's over," he said, his voice steady despite the weariness that now settled over him. He could feel the toll the battle had taken on his body, the strain of pushing himself beyond his limits. But the sight of the dead WRM at his feet brought him a sense of satisfaction. He had won, and the power he sought was now within his grasp. Vitalyara's voice broke through the silence, her tone filled with concern. "Lucavian, you need to rest. You've pushed yourself too hard. And these injuries—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "But first I need to finish this." Lucavian knew he couldn't just reach out and absorb the death energy by pushing his hand. The energy in this place was different, denser, more potent. It required a different approach, one that would allow him to fully harness the chaotic power that surrounded him. Ignoring the pain that racked his body, Lucavian lowered himself to the ground, crossing his legs as he assumed a meditative posture. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world around him, and focused on his breathing. Each breath was slow and deliberate, drawing in the cold, dark air of the crater and releasing it in a steady rhythm. The death energy in the crater was thick, almost tangible. It clung to the air like a heavy mist, seeping into every corner of the barren landscape. The lesser abyssal WYRM's presence had left an indelible mark on this place, its abyssal energy mingling with the residual death energy from the countless creatures it had slain. This place was like a nexus of death, a perfect environment for Lucavian to strengthen the first vortex. "I'm walking a fine line," he mused, his mind swirling with the dark energy that filled the crater, balancing life and death, creation and destruction. It's not something that should be taken lightly. As he continued to breathe, Lucavian could feel the energy beginning to respond to him. It was subtle at first, a faint tingling sensation at the edge of his consciousness, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. The death energy began to flow toward him, drawn by the flame of equinox within his core. Lucavian remained perfectly still, his focus unyielding. He allowed the energy to gather around him, letting it seep into his body with every breath. "Don't stop now. Such an opportunity will never come again like this." The process was slow and methodical. He couldn't afford to rush it, not with the injuries he had sustained. But despite the pain, he persisted, knowing that this was the only way to fully harness the power he needed. Ignore the pain. As the energy flowed into him, Lucavian could feel the first vortex within his core beginning to stabilize. Slowly, the black flame that represented the flame of equinox burned brighter, fed by the death energy that now surged through his veins. Lucavian visualized the vortex as a whirlpool, its spiraling layers growing more distinct as the death energy was drawn into it. Each layer represented a new level of mastery, a deeper connection to the abyssal power that now resided within him. He could feel the first layer forming, solidifying, as the energy flowed smoothly into place. It was still rough, still incomplete, but it was taking shape, becoming more defined with each breath. "Keep the control. It is becoming more and more chaotic." The pain in his body began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of power, a feeling of control over the chaos within him. The energy of the WYRM, combined with the death energy that saturated the crater, was exactly what he needed to push the vortex to the next level. Just a little more, Lucavian thought, his mind focused entirely on the process. He could feel the vortex nearing completion, the first layer almost fully formed. The energy swirled faster, tighter, condensing into a powerful force that threatened to break free of his control. But Lucavian held firm, his will unyielding as he guided the final strands of death energy into place. The vortex spun wildly, the black flame of the flame of equinox, burning brighter and colder, but it held together, its form solidifying into something more than just a chaotic swirl of energy. Huff! With a final breath, Lucavian felt the vortex click into place, the first layer complete. The energy within him stabilized, the wild chaos settling into a steady, controlled rhythm. The first vortex was finished, a powerful storm of life and death, creation and destruction, all held in perfect balance within his core. Lucavian slowly opened his eyes, feeling the energy thrumming through his veins. The exhaustion was still there, but it was overshadowed by the sense of accomplishment, the knowledge that he had taken another step toward mastering the power that now resided within him. The crater around him was still, the death energy drained from the air and absorbed into his being. He had done it. He had conquered the WYRM, absorbed its power, and completed the first stage of his new technique. Ha! His breathing was rough as he could feel the energy inside his core. But then he noticed the scene before him. What the hell happened? It was a scene of utter destruction. As the first vortex stabilized within Lucavian's core, the energy that had been swirling wildly settled into a harmonious rhythm, a perfect balance of life and death, fire and frost. Lucavian let out a long breath, the tension in his body releasing as the chaotic storm within him finally came under control. But just as he was beginning to savor the success of his breakthrough, the atmosphere around him shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable tension that seemed to ripple outward from where he sat. Lucavian didn't notice the change, his focus still inward, but Vitaliera, perched nearby, felt it immediately. Her sharp eyes widened as she saw something extraordinary. Above Lucavian's head, a pitch-black star began to form, shimmering into existence like a tear in the fabric of reality itself. The star was small at first, a point of darkness that absorbed all light around it, but it quickly expanded, its presence growing more oppressive, more intense. What? Vitaliara's thoughts raced as she watched the star pulse with a raw, chaotic energy unlike anything she had ever encountered before. The black star seemed to resonate with the vortex inside Lucavian, responding to the energies he had just harnessed. It was as if the very forces of the universe were bending to his will, drawn to the power he had cultivated. The star continued to expand, and then, without warning, it began to disperse. The darkness unraveled, stretching outwards until it took the form of a massive, swirling hurricane of black energy. The air around Lucavian twisted and distorted, the environment bending under the immense pressure of the phenomenon that had been unleashed. Vitaliara's concern deepened. This is more than just a breakthrough. It's like the energy is out of control. The hurricane of black energy spun faster and faster, the ground beneath Lucavian cracking and splintering as the forces at play grew more volatile. The entire crater seemed to tremble, the earth groaning under the strain of the energy Lucavian had unwittingly summoned. Vitaliera tried to call out to him, but her voice was lost in the deafening roar of the hurricane. She could only watch in alarm as the situation spiraled beyond anything she had anticipated. This was no ordinary breakthrough, this was something far more dangerous, more chaotic. And then, in a blinding instant, the hurricane contracted, collapsing in on itself with a force that sent shockwaves ripping through the air. The explosion that followed was immense, a detonation of pure energy that erupted from the center of the crater, sending debris flying in all directions. Vitaliera was thrown back by the force of the blast, tumbling through the air before she managed to regain her footing. She landed a distance away, her fur bristling as she tried to process what had just happened. When the dust and debris finally began to settle, Vitaliera forced herself to her feet, her eyes scanning the destruction left in the wake of the explosion. The crater had been deepened, its walls shattered and scorched, and in the center, where Lucavian had been meditating, a thick cloud of black smoke swirled ominously. Vitaliara's heart pounded in her chest as she approached cautiously, her senses alert for any sign of movement. "Lucavian, are you?" Before she could finish the thought, the smoke began to dissipate, revealing Lucavian's form within. He stood in the center of the chaos, breathing heavily but with a satisfied face. But then, upon seeing the scene, he could not help but look surprised. What the hell happened here? Chapter 88. First Vortex. 2. Lucavian's eyes widened in genuine surprise as he took in the devastation around him. The once solid ground had been reduced to a shattered landscape, and the air was thick with lingering traces of raw, chaotic energy. He turned to Vitaliera, his expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Vitaliera, still shaken from the force of the explosion, approached him cautiously, her eyes filled with concern. "It was because of you, Lucavian," she replied, her tone serious. "The energy you unleashed during your breakthrough, it was far more destructive than anything I've ever seen." "Because of me?" Lucavian repeated, still trying to comprehend the extent of the destruction he had caused. He looked down at his hands as if expecting to see some trace of the power that had just erupted from within him. But they were steady, and the energy within him had settled into a calm, controlled rhythm. Vitaliera nodded, her gaze never leaving him. "The power you've harnessed, the flame of Equinox, it's not just powerful, it's volatile. The forces you're dealing with aren't meant to be tamed easily, and when they're pushed too far, they can become incredibly destructive." Lucavian furrowed his brow, the realization slowly sinking in. I see. I was just trying to stabilize the vortex, to bring it under control, and was just too focused on my core. I missed what was happening outside. Indeed, Vitaliera acknowledged, her tone softening slightly. You have already tapped into a power that goes beyond normal limits. The vortex within you, it's a force of nature, a balance of life and death, and when that balance is disturbed, it can unleash chaos. Lucavian took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. The thrill of the breakthrough, the surge of power, it had felt like nothing he had ever experienced before. This is really different. He could feel the energy now wanting to go out of his body. After all, the moment one would reach the second start realm, they would now be able to control the mana out of the core. Lucavian took a deep breath, centering himself as he turned his focus inward. The devastation around him faded into the background as he honed in on the energy within his core. He could feel it. A powerful, swirling force, no longer just contained within him but now pulsing with a new level of intensity. Let's see, he thought, his mind zeroing in on the flame of equinox. As he peered into his core, Lucavian's eyes widened slightly. The once flickering black flame that had represented the flame of equinox was now burning with a steady, fierce light. It had changed, grown. The energy had solidified into something more potent, more tangible. The vortex that had been chaotic and uncontrolled before now spun with purpose and direction. He could see the layers of energy, each one representing a new level of mastery, spiraling together in perfect harmony. The energy was no longer just something he could harness within his body. It was something he could project outward, something that could extend beyond the confines of his core. Lucavian's gaze shifted to his estoc, still stained with the blood of the lesser abyssal WRM. His hand tightened around the hilt, the metal cool and familiar against his skin. Let's try it. With a deliberate focus, he willed the flame of equinox to flow through him, directing the energy toward the blade. He could feel the mana responding to his command, surging from his core and traveling through his reversed meridians, a sensation that was both familiar and new. The energy felt different now, stronger, more assertive, but also more controlled. As the energy reached the estoc, the blade began to glow faintly, the dark metal taking on an eerie, almost ethereal quality. The black flame of the flame of equinox licked along the edge of the sword, casting an unnatural light in the dim surroundings. Lucavian felt a thrill of power as he watched the flame dance along the blade. It wasn't just a visual effect. The energy was real, tangible, and he could feel it waiting to kill. Now, let's see what you can do. With that thought, Lucavian took a decisive step forward, raising his estoc high before bringing it down in a swift, calculated arc. Slash! The blade slashed through the air, aimed directly at the thick carcass on one of the skewers of the lesser abyssal WIRM that lay scattered around him. He could feel the resistance as the blade met the hardened flesh, dense and tough, even in the creature's weakened state. But then, something unexpected happened. As the blade made contact, the black flame of the flame of equinox flared, sinking into the skewer. The estoc cut through the tough flesh, not effortlessly, but with a noticeable resistance. It wasn't the clean, effortless slice he had hoped for, but it was enough. The blade passed through the skewer, leaving a deep, jagged cut in its wake. Lucavian frowned slightly. So, it's not as smooth as I thought. He could tell that while the flame of equinox had enhanced his strike, it wasn't quite the same as when he wielded the Devourer of Stars. The energy didn't seem to project beyond the blade as he had imagined. Instead, it was contained in a weird way. If the starlight was like a compressed laser, this one was a fire that would ignite. And it did just that. The black flame, which had sunk into the flesh, was spreading. The point where his blade had made contact was starting to smolder, the fire eating away at the carcass. It wasn't a fast process, but it was relentless. The flame slowly consumed the skewer, eroding the dense material and reducing it to a blackened, crumbling mess. Lucavian watched with a mix of curiosity and satisfaction. It's not just a simple enhancement. This flame has a corrosive property. The skewer continued to disintegrate, the black flame devouring it from the inside out. Where the blade had made its mark, the fire spread, melting the flesh as it went, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. It was a slow, creeping destruction, but there was no denying its effectiveness. The flame of death, a fitting name, is it not? He thought with a smile. There was something weird with that flame, something that was far more dangerous than he could see. But he did not know what it was for the time being. For the time being. So, this is how the flame of equinox works now. He thought, his mind racing with possibilities. The power was there, potent and deadly, but it required a different approach. He couldn't just rely on brute force. He needed to be precise and strategic, using the flame's corrosive nature to his advantage. He glanced down at his estoc, the blade still faintly glowing with the remnants of the black flame. But then he noticed something. Your blade. It cannot hold your flames. Vital Yara's voice echoed in his mind, her tone laced with concern as she observed the estoc. She was right. The weapon was clearly struggling to contain the power of the flame of equinox. The corrosive nature of the black flame wasn't just devouring his enemies. It was slowly consuming his blade as well. Lucavian ran his fingers along the blade's surface, feeling the rough texture where the metal had started to degrade. The estoc had been his companion through thick and thin, but now it was clear that it couldn't keep up with the demands of his newfound power. The thought of losing the weapon, of it shattering in the middle of a crucial fight, sent a chill down his spine. It's already starting to break down, Lucavian thought grimly. He could see the damage spreading, the cracks widening ever so slightly as the corrosive energy continued to eat away at the metal. I haven't been able to take proper care of it in the forest. And now it's paying the price. His time in the wilderness had been grueling, with little opportunity to maintain or repair his gear. The materials he needed were scarce, and the battles had taken their toll. The estoc, which had been his companion for many years, was now reaching its limit. Vital Yara's voice broke through his thoughts again, this time more solemn. The techniques you've been using, Lucavian, they demand too much from your blade. Especially that last one. It's a technique that's far more advanced than you're ready for, and you didn't execute it well. Never forget, if you ever break a sword, it is not because of the blade but because of your lack of ability. He remembered what Gerald had said to him once. Vital Yara's words just meant the same thing. Indeed, that is right. Vitaliera watched Lucavian closely, her eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke. His determination was clear. As Lucavian looked at her with a slight smile, saying, "Indeed, that is right. But there is not much that can be done about this, is there? Next time, I should put more effort into perfecting my technique." She couldn't help but feel a pang of worry. Vitaliera shook her head slowly, her gaze softening as she considered his words. She knew how much time Lucavian had already spent honing his skills, how he had poured every ounce of his being into perfecting his swordsmanship. And now, even after all that effort, he was saying he needed to do more. He's indeed crazy when it comes to the sword, Vitaliera thought, her tone inward, almost affectionate in its exasperation. But she kept the thought to herself, not wanting to dampen his spirit. She understood his drive, his need to push beyond his limits, but it was still difficult to watch him be so hard on himself. Lucavian, unaware of her internal musings, continued to examine the estoc, his mind already turning over new ideas and strategies. Vitaliera sighed inwardly. He won't stop, not until he's perfected every last detail. And even then, he'll find something else to strive for. Despite her concerns, she couldn't help but admire his tenacity. It was what had brought him this far, after all, and she knew it would continue to drive him forward, no matter the obstacles. "Now, let me rest a little," Lucavian mumbled as he grabbed the one last healing potion that he had in his pouch. "And then we will leave this forest." It was time for him to leave this place. Chapter 89. Leaving the forest. As Lucavian settled into a meditative posture, the healing potion working its magic on his battered body, Vitaliera moved silently through the remnants of the battlefield. Her sharp eyes scanned the area, taking in the scattered scales of the lesser abyssal WYRM that had been blown away by Lucavian's final strike. The scales, once a part of the beast's impenetrable armor, were now strewn across the crater, their dark, reflective surfaces glinting ominously in the dim light. Vitaliera began to gather the scales, her movements precise and deliberate. Each scale was a reminder of the fierce battle that had just taken place, a testament to Lucavian's relentless drive and the power he had unleashed. She handled them with care, knowing that they held a significance beyond their immediate value. They were pieces of a creature that had been formidable, and they might still serve a purpose in the future. After all, most of the time, a beast's remains can be used for many things. The carcasses, especially for beasts with scales like these, would be used for making weapons. And since the lesser abyssal WYRM was a best-of-peak 3-star rank, it was something that would not be easily hunted. Because of that, the value it posed would be much higher. He can even make a weapon from its scales. That was what she had thought. As she worked, Vitaliara's gaze occasionally drifted back to Lucavian, who remained seated in meditation, his breathing slow and even. The contrast between the two scenes was striking. Around her, the landscape was a portrait of destruction. The ground was shattered, scorched, and marred by deep scars where the flame of equinox had burned through flesh and stone alike. The air was thick with the lingering scent of ash and decay, a grim reminder of the life that had been snuffed out in this place. But in the midst of this devastation, there was Lucavian, a figure of complete stillness and tranquility. His expression was calm. His body relaxed as the healing potion did its work. The chaos that had erupted from his breakthrough had subsided, leaving behind only the quiet, focused energy of his meditation to recover his starlight energy. It was as if he had become a part of the stillness, a serene presence in the eye of the storm. The tranquility in him, it's almost unsettling, Vitaliera mused, her thoughts tinged with a mix of admiration and concern. To be so calm after causing such destruction, it was indeed a rare thing. Not everyone would possess such a quality. He was indeed not lying when he said he had seen enough, she thought. As she continued to gather the scales, her mind wandered back to the moment when the black star had formed above Lucavian, when the air had crackled with raw, chaotic energy. The memory of that power, so overwhelming and untamed, made her shiver slightly. That star. It was of an abyss but at the same time of a cosmos. Being a mythical beast who had seen countless different things, she could easily say that that star was not something that was normal. Just what are you, Lucavian? She could not help but think. And just what kind of monster have you released to the world, Gerald? There were many questions but no answers at all. In the end, she could only shake her head, looking at the play of fate. The play of the fate. Vitaliera cast one last glance at the destruction around her before turning back to Lucavian. His breathing had steadied, the tension in his muscles easing as the healing potion took effect. The harsh lines of exhaustion that had marred his face were softening, replaced by the calm determination that was so characteristic of him. With her task complete, Vitaliera approached Lucavian quietly, settling down nearby to keep watch over him as he continued his meditation. The peak around them was silent, as if holding its breath in the aftermath of the battle. Even the usual sounds of distant creatures had faded, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of the wind. Let's see what the play has in store for you, she thought, and whatever it was, she would follow him. After all, she was his contracted beast from now on. As Lucavian's meditation drew to a close, his breathing deepened, and a final wave of energy swept through his body, signaling the end of his recovery. Slowly, he opened his eyes, feeling the residual warmth of the healing potion dissipate as his starlight energy fully replenished. His muscles, once tight with strain, now felt refreshed and ready to move. That is good. I can now leave this place. He looked around the crater, taking in the aftermath of the battle one last time. The destruction was extensive, a testament to the fight that had just happened here, but he felt no attachment to the scene. It was just another step in his journey, one that had left its mark but was now behind him. He glanced at Vitaliera, who had been quietly watching over him, her presence a comforting constant. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging that the time had come to move on. The map will show the way, Lucavian thought as he reached into his pouch and retrieved the old, worn map of the shadowed thicket. He had studied it countless times during his stay here, memorizing the paths, the landmarks, and the dangers that lay in wait. The exit is to the north, through the dense undergrowth. Then past the River of Shrouded Echoes. The River of Shrouded Echoes was a wide, fast-moving river that cut through the heart of the shadowed thicket. "I'll need to clean myself before we go," Lucavian murmured, his voice steady as he sheathed his estoc and adjusted his gear. The blade, though worn and cracked, was still a part of him, and he wouldn't discard it until he had something to replace it with. "Looks like you will be with me for a little longer," he thought with a small smile. Vitaliera, who had finished gathering the scales of the lesser abyssal WIRM, nodded in agreement. "It's a good idea. The river will help you clear your mind as well." Lucavian gave her a brief smile before turning his attention to the path ahead. The forest was quiet, the usual sounds of life muted as if the creatures themselves were wary of what had transpired here. Well, that was to be expected. After all, the leader of this place was now dead, and most of the beasts would have already sensed it. This place will turn chaotic soon. Not long after, seeing that no one was claiming this place, more and more beasts would flood here. After all, the peak could very well be a place where many monsters could reside. He took one last look at the battlefield, at the smoldering remnants of the WIRM and the scars left by his breakthrough. This place, I will not forget it. With that, Lucavian began his trek toward the River of Shrouded Echoes, Vitaliera following close behind. The journey was uneventful, the forest seemingly devoid of any immediate threats. Perhaps the presence of the lesser abyssal WIRM had kept other creatures at bay, or perhaps they were simply lying low, sensing the power that Lucavian had unleashed. After a short walk, they reached the river's edge. The water was as dark as Lucavian remembered, its surface reflecting the twisted branches of the trees above, creating a distorted, haunting image of the world around them. The sound of the rushing water was soothing, a stark contrast to the silence that had enveloped the forest. With a sigh, he began to strip off the clothes he had been wearing for what felt like an eternity. The fabric was stiff with dried blood, dirt, and sweat, the remnants of countless battles and harsh conditions. The once sturdy material was now worn and frayed, barely holding together after enduring the rigors of the shadowed thicket. "I guess I need to change my clothes from now on," Lucavian thought, glancing at the path that led out of the forest. He knew that leaving this place would no longer pose a significant threat. The time he had spent here had sharpened his senses and instincts to a razor's edge, allowing him to navigate the dangers with ease. The monsters that once haunted his every step were now merely obstacles to be avoided or dispatched without much effort. As he discarded his clothing, Lucavian's bare body was revealed, a testament to the relentless training and battles he had endured. His physique was lean and sculpted, not bulky, but every muscle was defined and firm, a result of the intense physical regimen he had subjected himself to. But what truly stood out were the scars. They were scattered across his body, small cuts, slashes, and marks that told the story of his past. Each one was a reminder of a battle fought, a near miss, or a wound that could have been fatal. They were remnants of his time on the battlefield, each scar a chapter in the saga of his life as a warrior. "Are you not coming?" He turned to look at Vitaliera, who was just looking at him with her eyes. The small cat somehow looked sad. Cats dislike water, and Vitaliera appeared to be grumpy. End of the second volume. Chapter 90, Festival. Rakenshore City. Rakenshore, a modest city perched on the edge of the Empire of Arcanes, hummed with a newfound energy. Nestled against the backdrop of jagged mountains, the city had long been a place of tension, its people bearing the brunt of the Empire's ambitions. But today, the streets were transformed. The war had finally ended, and Rakenshore was free to celebrate. Bright banners of crimson and gold, the colors of the Empire, fluttered from every rooftop and balcony. catching the soft summer breeze that carried the scent of roasting meats and fresh-baked bread. The central square, usually a place of hurried transactions and wary glances, had become the heart of the festival. Stalls lined the cobblestone paths, their owners shouting to passers-by, offering everything from spiced wine to intricate trinkets. At the center of the square stood a grand statue, newly erected to commemorate the empire's victory. The figure of a stern-faced major of the city, sword raised in triumph, loomed over the festivities, a reminder of the price paid for this celebration. Yet, the people did not shy away from its shadow. Instead, they danced beneath it, children darting through the crowd with laughter that had been absent for far too long. The streets of Rakenshore buzzed with conversation, the air thick with the sounds of lively chatter and the scent of summer blooms. Farmers and their families filled the square, their faces flushed with the rare joy of peace. "I tell you, Barak, I haven't seen a hall this good in years," an older man with weathered hands and a broad smile remarked, lifting a mug of spiced wine to his lips. His name was Corwin, a farmer whose fields had been the lifeblood of his family for generations. "Aye, Corwin," his friend Barak responded, a grin splitting his sun-tanned face. "The land's been good to us, even with the war hanging over our heads. But I won't lie. I'm glad we don't have to send any more of our best crops to the front lines." Corwin nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "We gave what we could, but it's been hard on everyone. My boy, Lyle, he's been worried we'd lose the farm if the taxes kept rising." Barak clapped Corwin on the back, his voice reassuring. "Well, Lyle can rest easy now. The war's over, and we've got a good harvest ahead of us. We'll fill our own tables before we fill the Empire's stores again." Nearby, a young woman named Greta, her arms full of vibrant wildflowers, joined the conversation. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Not having to look over our shoulders anymore, worrying if this season's crops will go to our families or the soldiers." Barak nodded, his gaze drifting to the statue of the Major in the square's center. "We've all made sacrifices, but today's different. We can finally enjoy the fruits of our labor." Greta's eyes sparkled with a mixture of relief and hope. "And we can plan for the future now, plant what we want instead of what's needed for rations. My father's been talking about expanding the orchard. Says we might finally be able to afford it." Corwin chuckled, raising his mug in a toast. "Here's to that, Greta. May your orchards grow as full as your heart." As the three continued to talk, their voices blending with the general hum of the festival, the crowd's attention was drawn toward the center of the square. There, atop a small platform draped in the Empire's colors, stood the Baron overseeing Rakenshore. Baron Edris Windhall, a man of middle years with a dignified bearing and the crest of his family. A silver tree on a field of green, emblazoned on his chest, raised a hand to the crowd. His presence commanded respect, yet his eyes held a warmth that endeared him to the citizens. "My friends, my fellow citizens of Rakenshore," Baron Windhall began, his voice carrying easily over the gathered throng. "Today, we celebrate not just the Empire's victory but our own. We have endured hardships together. Together, we have supported our soldiers and our empire with the bounty of our lands. And now we reap the rewards." The crowd erupted in cheers, the noise a cathartic release after months of tension. Baron Windhall continued, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Let this festival be a reminder that the strength of Rakenshore lies not just in our soil but in our spirit. As we move forward, may our fields grow ever more bountiful, and may our hearts remain ever united." Corwin, Barak, and Greta joined in the applause, their hands meeting in a shared rhythm of gratitude and hope. Around them, the celebration surged with renewed vigor, the citizens of Rakenshore buoyed by the words of their Baron. "Baron Windhall's a good man," Barak said, his voice filled with respect. "He knows what we've been through, and he stood by us through it all." Corwin nodded in agreement. "He has, and now we can stand tall, knowing our work has brought us here." Yet the gaze belonging to Greta was not the same as the others. It was a little different. There was a small hatred on her face, an expression that many others have missed. "Ring," But amongst the music and the cheerfulness of the festival, her expression had disappeared without being noticed by anyone at all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the festival in Rackenshaw showed no signs of slowing down. The music grew louder, the dances more exuberant, and the laughter more uninhibited as the people celebrated the end of their long ordeal. The stalls were still bustling with activity, though the barrels of spiced wine were rapidly emptying, and the scent of roasted meats mingled with the sweet tang of spilled ale. Children, tired from hours of play, were now clinging to their parents, their eyelids heavy but their spirits still high. The more seasoned citizens, too, were beginning to feel the effects of the day's festivities. Many had found their way to the long wooden tables set up in the square, their faces flushed from drink and cheer, sharing stories of past harvests and dreams of a prosperous future. Yet, amid the revelry, Greta moved quietly, her steps steady and purposeful. She offered polite smiles and nods to those who greeted her, but her mind was elsewhere. The flicker of hatred that had crossed her face earlier was now buried deep within, hidden behind the practiced calm of someone used to keep her true feelings to herself. As the night wore on, the festival began to wind down. The music slowed to a softer, more languid pace, and the once roaring fires in the square burned low. Drunken voices rose in song, the lyrics slurred and joyous, as groups of friends leaned on one another, staggering through the cobblestone streets toward their homes. Greta, too, finally turned her steps toward home. Her family's inn, the verdant hearth, stood on the edge of the square, a sturdy stone building with warm lights glowing from its windows. The inn had been in her family for generations, and it was as much a part of Rackenshaw as the fields and orchards that surrounded the city. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, Greta was greeted by the familiar sounds of her family's bustling establishment. The common room was filled with patrons, many of them regulars, who were either too drunk to find their way home or preferred the company of others to an empty house. Her mother, a robust woman with a no-nonsense air, was behind the bar, expertly filling mugs of ale while her father moved among the tables, chatting with guests and ensuring everyone was well cared for. "Greta, there you are," her mother called out as she caught sight of her. "Come and help your father with the guests, will you? It's been a busy night." Greta moved swiftly through the common room of the verdant hearth, balancing trays of ale and plates of steaming food with the practiced ease of someone who had grown up in the bustling inn. The warmth of the hearth fire mixed with the hearty laughter and lively conversations, creating a cozy and welcoming atmosphere. "Greta, another round here," called a group of farmers huddled around a table near the fireplace. Their faces were flushed with drink and cheer, and they waved their mugs in the air, signaling their need for more ale. "Coming right up," Greta responded with a smile, expertly weaving her way through the crowded room. As she approached the table, she caught snippets of their conversation. "Did you hear about Old Man Rake's harvest? Biggest one in years, they say," one of the farmers said, his voice slurred but enthusiastic. I heard. We might finally get some good prices at the market this year," another added, raising his mug in a toast. Greta set down the fresh mugs of ale, and one of the farmers, a burly man with a bushy beard, gave her a grateful nod. "Thanks, lass. You're a blessing, you are." She offered a polite smile in return and moved on to the next table, where a group of merchants were engaged in a heated discussion about the best trade routes now that the war was over. The clinking of coins and the rustling of maps punctuated their conversation, and Greta couldn't help but listen in as she served them their drinks. "The southern pass is open again, but the tolls are higher than ever," one of the merchants complained, shaking his head. "Better to pay the toll than risk the old forest road," another countered, taking a deep swig of his ale. "Bandits are still lurking there, I hear." As Greta continued to move through the room, her hands busy but her mind elsewhere, she suddenly felt a shift in the atmosphere. The lively chatter and laughter seemed to quiet just a bit, as if the very air in the inn had thickened with unspoken tension. "Oh, lively, isn't it?" And she heard the voice of someone she disliked from the bottom of her heart. Chapter 91, Wanderer. "Oh, lively, isn't it?" Greta's heart sank at the sound of that familiar, grating voice. She turned slowly to see the young man striding into the inn, his bulky frame taking up more space than necessary as he made his entrance. His rough, unshaven face was split into a wide grin that never reached his cold eyes, and his swaggering gait was accompanied by the sound of heavy boots clomping on the wooden floor. "Well, well, if it isn't the lovely Greta," the young man drawled, his voice dripping with mockery as he approached her. His name was Radgar, and he had become a thorn in the side of many in Rakenshore since his recent elevation to the Baron's garrison. Behind him, a group of similarly rough-looking men followed, all of them wearing the same smug expressions. They were his cronies, fellow soldiers who had taken to exploiting their new positions with disturbing enthusiasm. The other patrons of the inn shifted uncomfortably, their previous lively conversations now reduced to uneasy murmurs as Radgar and his entourage made their presence known. Greta forced herself to remain calm, though her stomach churned with unease. "Good evening, Radgar," she greeted him politely, though her tone was far less warm than it had been with the other guests. Radgar's grin widened as he stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Oh, don't be so cold, Greta. We're here to celebrate just like everyone else. Why don't you bring us a round of your finest ale? And maybe a little something extra, just for me?" His eyes roved over her in a way that made her skin crawl. She knew exactly what he meant by something extra, and it took all her willpower not to recoil in disgust. But she couldn't afford to provoke him, not when he had the Baron's favor and the power to make life difficult for her family. After all, with the recent war that was happening around the Valerius Plains, most of the soldiers from the garrison had been sent to the war. That was why there was a need for new recruitment, and that was also why people like Radgar were also chosen for this place. But there can be nothing done. With how the finances of the city being tight and the manpower being short, things were really hard for both Baron and the citizens. Considering the bandits that had frequently appeared, the importance of the soldiers increased. That was why no one could oppose, at least not the common folk. "I'll get your drinks," she replied evenly, turning away to head back to the bar. As she did, she heard the snickers and crude comments from Radgar's companions, their voices carrying through the inn like an unpleasant stench. As Greta prepared the drinks, she could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, their sympathy mixed with helplessness. Radgar had made it clear to everyone that he was untouchable, and anyone who dared to stand up to him would pay the price. Even Baron Windhall, who was generally well regarded by the people, seemed either oblivious or indifferent to the abuses carried out by his new soldier. When she returned to the table with the tray of ale, Radgar reached out to grab her wrist, pulling her closer than was necessary. "Why don't you stay a while, Greta? We could use some company," he said, his breath hot and foul against her skin. Greta gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay calm. "I have other customers to serve, Radgar. Please, let go." Radgar's grip tightened, his fingers digging painfully into Greta's wrist as his expression darkened. The cheerful facade he wore moments ago slipped, revealing the simmering anger beneath. "I said sit here," he growled, his voice low and menacing, sending a chill down Greta's spine. Greta's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat as she felt the full weight of Radgar's dominance. Why? She asked herself. For this reason, she needed to endure such a thing. Her body stiffened, and she instinctively tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron, unyielding and cold. A shiver ran through her as fear settled deep within her chest, constricting her lungs and making it difficult to breathe. She glanced around the room, hoping, praying, that someone would step in, that someone would have the courage to stand up to Radgar. But all she saw were lowered gazes and averted eyes. The patrons who had been so lively moments before now seemed to shrink into themselves, unwilling to draw Radgar's attention. Her gaze then met her father's across the room. He stood behind the bar, his hands clenched tightly around a mug, the knuckles white with tension. His eyes were filled with sorrow and helplessness, a reflection of the same emotions that Greta felt. He looked like he wanted nothing more than to come to her aid, but the knowledge of what Radgar could do, what he had the power to do, kept him rooted in place. The weight of her father's sadness and powerlessness bore down on Greta, adding to the crushing despair she felt. She was trapped, caught between her own fear and the reality of her situation. There was no one who could help her, no one who would stand up to Radgar, not even the man she loved most in the world. As if sensing the shift in her emotions, Radgar's expression changed once more. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by that unsettling, too bright grin he often wore. He let out a loud, forced laugh, the sound grating against Greta's nerves. "Ah, don't be like that, Greta. We're just having a bit of fun, aren't we?" he said, his tone suddenly light and jovial, as if he hadn't just threatened her. He loosened his grip on her wrist, though he didn't let go entirely, his thumb tracing slow, possessive circles on her skin. Disgusting, disgusting, disgusting. The shift in his demeanor was disorienting, the sudden change from anger to false cheerfulness making Greta's head spin. She knew better than to believe the mask he wore now. It was just a cover for the darkness that lurked beneath. But just as the nausea threatened to overwhelm her, the door to the inn burst open with a loud bang, causing every head in the room to turn in unison. The sudden noise sliced through the oppressive atmosphere, and for a brief moment, all eyes were on the entrance. Standing in the doorway was a young man, slightly above average height, around 180 centimeters. His clothes were rough and travel-worn, the kind a weary traveler might wear after days on the road. His face was shadowed by the hood of his cloak, and though his features were hard to discern, it was clear that he was a stranger, someone unfamiliar to the people of Rakenshore. The room held its breath as the newcomer stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He ignored the curious and wary gazes of the patrons, his presence unsettling the previously boisterous atmosphere. It was as if his very entrance had cast a shadow over the room, one that made even the most brazen hesitate. Who is he? Greta wondered, her discomfort momentarily pushed aside by this new arrival. The man's silence was almost eerie, and there was something about the way he moved, purposeful, unhurried, that made him seem as though he was in control of the entire room without saying a word. Trailing closely behind him was a small cat, its sleek white fur a stark contrast to the roughness of the traveler's attire. The cat moved with the same quiet grace as its master, curling around his neck like a living scarf, its bright eyes scanning the room with an intelligence that belied its size. Radgar's grip on Greta's wrist loosened as his attention shifted to the newcomer. The forced smile slipped from his face, replaced by a scowl of irritation. "Who the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath, his gaze narrowing as he watched the stranger's every move. The traveler paid no mind to Radgar or anyone else in the room. He moved toward an empty table near the far wall, his steps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Once there, he pulled out a chair and sat down, the cat leaping onto the table with effortless ease. For a moment, silence reigned. The tension in the room was palpable, the patrons unsure of what to make of this mysterious figure. Even Radgar, who thrived on asserting his dominance, seemed momentarily at a loss. Greta, still standing by Radgar's side, felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. It was faint, almost fragile, but it was there. The stranger's arrival had disrupted the oppressive control Radgar held over the room, if only for a moment. Could this be a chance? The thought was barely formed before Radgar let out a derisive snort, the moment of hesitation gone. He released Greta's wrist completely, turning his full attention to the newcomer. "Hey, you!" Radgar called out, his voice carrying across the room. "You've got some nerve, barging in here like that." But that hope was soon crushed. After all, the traveler was also targeted by Ragna, and he was also not spared.